And welcome to another episode of G220 Radio. Tonight we're going to be talking about different aspects of theology. This is episode number 312. I'm Ricky Gantz, and I'm joined with Mike Miller, and we want to thank you for tuning into the program tonight. Mike, how you doing, brother?
Doing pretty good. Started a class this week, so school's starting to come full swing, and starting my last semester at Southern. So this is kind of exciting.
Nice. Last semester, man.
Yeah.
It was going to come.
I didn't think so. 3 classes and that's it. Yeah. Well, then since I want to go for PhD, I still got more classes, more classwork afterwards. But yeah, at least for my MDiv, I'm done.
Right. Nice. So, brother, we've got a topic here tonight, different aspects of theology. I'm going to go ahead and do some side stuff here and make sure this is out there for those that are tuning in. They can tune in and listen live. And so while I'm doing that, man, why don't you go ahead and just give an overview of what we're going to be getting into tonight, and then we'll just go from there.
Yeah, so this is a topic that I've thought about off and on for a couple of years now when it was first taught to me in a systematics class. And just kind of thinking through these issues. You have different ideas, different theologies. You come through and you have systematics, and they're kind of different bins. Then one thing that opened up kind of my eyes, which I didn't have in my undergrad, is this idea of biblical theology and what is biblical theology and kind of why is it important? And realizing this is not like a newer phenomenon within the Christian realm. It might have more of a technical term, and it might become more of a more technical field of study. We have now, and then so the question is, how do all these relate and they go together? Are they separate, in a way, and just kind of then as going through seminary and going through the different classes, and then just being under, biblical preaching, these are just kind of topics and seeing them kind of how they come together. And then just my own apologetic nature, and then how these kind of apply then. And when we get into theological debates with other people, whether it's the Arminians or the Pelagians or, modalists or people who kind of deny the sufficiency of Scripture, arguments come up, and you have it becomes now just much more than, well, what does the Bible say? Because everyone has, what does the Bible say? So you got to say, well, how does it fit within itself? How does it fit as we pull it together? So all these things kind of come together when we argue for certain beliefs. And so we kind of tackle this a little bit, try to give a good basic understanding how these kind of all relate with each other, and then kind of how these, work out apologetically, and kind of the priority to set between them. What should we argue first? Which one isn't necessarily argument, but supports? I think these are all different ways to help us become better at evangelism, even talking to atheists and understanding just the development of Christian theology. The development of some of this can help us to better answer some of the critiques that they have, especially dealing with Christendom's past. So hopefully it'll be an exciting show, a clear show, and a fun show.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about these different aspects of theology, because as you said, it's very important, and it all goes together in what we do here on G220 Radio and the way we view the things we talk about and why we hold to the things that we hold to from a biblical perspective. And just thinking of the conversation we had last week with Josh Sexton, who holds to a oneness, nuanced position, but a oneness view. When you look at historically, theology, historical, going back and looking at how some of these councils and these doctrines came to be, it really helps you understand to where you don't fall into those ditches and fall into those heretical positions. However, unfortunately, a lot of people tend to What do they say? We don't need theology. We don't need doctrine. We just need Jesus, man. That's all we need. Jesus and love.
Which I like to point out is a theology. Poor one, but as a theology nonetheless. Because, I mean, let's just define theology in general. It's the study of God. No, well, in systematics, you have, we'll call like theology proper, and that's study at the being of God as he is, the attributes of God, and kind of that way, and the study of the Father is looped into that. But you just know, when you think about it, theology is any study of God. So even if you want to say we should just love Jesus, well, how do you love Jesus? Well, you have to learn about him. Now you're studying about him. You're doing theology. Everyone does theology.
Right.
Even atheists do theology. They won't admit it. They probably won't say it, but they do. It's atheistic theology. It's a theology devoid of any God, but they're still doing theology in that way. So, we just gotta know everyone's doing theology. So now the question is, whose theology is right?
Yeah, that's one of the theological positions is natural theology. And the Bible tells us in Romans 1, everyone knows that God exists, but they suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. So when you, as you said, when that atheist is saying to you, no such thing as an atheist, by the way, but when they're saying to you that, I don't believe in God, or I don't, they're at best an agnostic, they are still holding to natural theology because they can look around and see, as the Bible declares to us, you see this general revelation given to us. So we see the natural theology, as you said, theology, the study of God. They don't even realize it, but they are. They're borrowing from God's creation. They're borrowing from God's giving us the ability to reason and to think, and as he's created us in his likeness. And usually it comes down to reason and philosophy, but it's a natural theology.
Yeah, I think we'll come to this when we kind of start discussing systematic. All, systematic takes all revelation. So we can say that all truth is God's truth. Even if an atheist scientist is discovering true things, we can say, well, that's God's truth. God's using you in that way. But we can talk about that more in a little bit. So to start out with, and kind of just to go out, we're going to start with just exegesis. And, we've talked a little bit about it. There's two ways to interpret the Bible. You have exegesis and eisegesis. Eisegesis is just simply you have your thoughts and you try to go to the Bible and you find where your thoughts may fit in, and you can kind of use that. Sometimes you cherry pick verses, just pull them out of context. It's like, look, here it is. Exegesis is the much more difficult task, and it's just simply discovering what the text means. So when you're reading a text, what does it mean? What is it saying? You look at the grammatical aspect of it, understanding its flow within it. And so exegesis is purely interacting with the biblical text. And why we kind of want to start here, even though it's not a theology, this becomes foundational for everything else that follows afterwards. And then this is why, we talk about, and studying the Bible right. We brought Dr. Croto in for translation. So how can we use translations to help us to study the word better? We've talked about some of these other things related. So everything we do, we start at a textual level. Even Keith Giles, when we had him on a couple months ago, he's doing exegesis with it. And so now that kind of shows we need more than just exegesis, as we'll get to it. But then we just kind of have this basic, what does the text mean? I think it's just, important just to start that, because we have special revelation. Right. God has given us something to study and to know him by.
Right. Yeah, this is very important for us to understand that. And as you said, there's more to it, because I mean, we hear so often, especially over the last couple of weeks, in interactions that I've personally had with some anti-Calvinistic people, and they'll say, well, the text says here plainly, and they'll read a few verses in their minds in context and say, see, it's plain and simple there. But you have to be able to look at this and say, okay, it's saying that, or it appears to be saying that, but what is the overall picture saying? What does the scripture say? Because we can't see here. It seems to be saying something apparent, but then that's kind of contradictory to something else over here. So we have to look at the bigger picture and get a bigger understanding of the context. And so while exegesis is absolutely the more biblical way than eisegesis, you don't want to read things into the text and try to make it say what you want it to say. But we also have to be careful, very careful with our exegesis to not end up doing the very same thing we're trying to not do with eisegesis and reading something into the text that's not there.
Yeah, I think it's just even more fundamental. There are right ways to do exegesis and wrong ways. Cherry picking a verse and kind of explaining its parts doesn't help, do it. And there's some debate on this kind of in the biblical scholarship world on interpretation. Is like a sentence the fundamental aspect of, or is a word or a sentence or kind of even a paragraph? Some have argued for a paragraph. But, there's still a verse is not isolated without a context with it. And this kind of moves us a little bit more into the idea of biblical theology, that, we're studying the text, we're learning it, and doing it, but coming kind of arising through it is this idea of biblical theology. And that is, what is the Bible talking about? The themes that they have. In the promo, I had a G.K. Beale's The New Testament Theology of Dr. Thomas Schreiner's has one too. Both good books if you want to do this. But then the question is, so what does the Bible have to say about itself? And what are the themes that the Bible keeps talking about? The ideas of like atonement, or the idea of new creation, the connection with creation and temple worship, and how those kind of react in the presence of God. So the Bible has these different themes that come throughout and are developed throughout the entire Bible. This is biblical theology. It's, what does the Bible have to say about these different themes? What is the focus of the entire canon of Scripture? So we have to have good exegesis, which leads to a good biblical theology. And now, not to take a shot at dispensational friends, it is noticeable that dispensationalists don't tend to do biblical theology, or it's very isolated. Kind of have your Old Testament and your New Testament. It's more the Reformed understanding of the Scripture that you have a more development of biblical theology as a whole. What does the Bible trying to convey? And this can go from, what is the theology of Genesis? What is kind of just the themes that Genesis wants us to know, or Exodus? And then you can go larger to the writings like the Pentateuch, like, the Old Testament or the New Testament, or just like that. So you have different levels of this. And then this is just quite the fascinating thing. Just take like creation for existence. You have creation and then the fall, but the temple and the tabernacle kind of represent this addition to a new creation, and with that then the presence of God. And as the Bible unfolds, we get a bigger idea of God's kingdom, God's rule, how he wants to do it. It moves from this idea of just a temple to a land to now the whole world and the presence of God. You have them in the temple, or God and man dwell together in the garden, but after sin, now you have to work your way. You have the temple tabernacle where it's secluded and only certain people can go, the high priest. Now with the New Testament, we have the Spirit dwelling in us, something even bigger in between, the Jesus being God is a part of this. But then we look forward to heaven, where we get to dwell with God like Adam did in the garden. And so these types of themes that run all the way through, people have tried to, develop like, what is the one theme the Old Testament talks about? And it's just hard because there's so many different themes, so many different ideas that run through the entire canon, that we need to kind of highlight these and help these, and this can help us, like the Arminian debate on with atonement. We can kind of look at this, and then our argument's not just exegetical, but like, what does the Bible have to say kind of about these ideas of the atonement, including the extent of the atonement and how all that works out. Again, this falls more into a biblical theological understanding with it.
Yeah, and it's also we had Robert Reese on maybe a year or so ago, along with he goes to church there with Emilio Ramos, and they have every year an Emmaus conference where they talk about biblical theology, and their themes there are to see Christ in the Old Testament, to see Christ in that. And so that's another form of biblical theology, like you said, looking at these different aspects of what is the scripture saying throughout. And that is one of those things where we see Christ in the Old Testament. One of the things, as you brought up dispensationalists, and not to continue to pick on them, but one of the things that they are, they want to hold on to a literal interpretation of the scriptures, although they don't always do that. But they'll say that they want to hold on to a literal interpretation of the scriptures, and they'll look and say, well, you only can see Christ wherever it explicitly says this is a representation. But when you look at biblical theology and you look in the Old Testament, and on that road of Emmaus, Jesus says, the Old Testament, it testifies of me, speaking of me. And so you can see pictures of Christ, types of Christ throughout the Old Testament, even where it's not explicitly revealed. Now, of course, caution, we do need to be careful and not try to look at under every single, rock, as some people do. And I was listening to some stuff today, and they were talking about, actually it was going through some of the church fathers, and we were talking about Origen and how, some of the allegorical methods and things came in, and then with Augustine. But I mean, so you don't want to go too far in that. You want to be very careful. That's why he's saying you want to have good exegesis, but you also want to incorporate a good understanding of what you're looking at, and not just, you don't want to go too far off into the deep end, basically.
Yeah, and I think, so I posted the sermon that my pastor gave on Mark 9 and the transfiguration of Jesus. And just, encourage our listeners, it's a great sermon, and it's a great exercise in biblical theology. I mean, he said a minimum of 16 themes is what he found. There could be even more in it. And just the different allusions that Mark is pulling and telling in the story, and why, in the transfiguration, it's Moses and Elijah. It's not like Moses and Isaiah or, other people, that these people are particular for that idea, showing that this is the prophet like Moses. He is on a hill like Moses and Elijah was. And this, I mean, there's a point in which biblical theology helps us to kind of bring color to the scripture. Understanding that Paul is kind of doing the same thing. He's seeing these types of themes, and he can go back and say, look, we should pay our pastors for gospel work because you don't muzzle the ox. And he's taking these ideas and like, look, these apply to us. So biblical theology simply tries to seek, to try to understand the story as a whole, the grand narrative, and all the other places that put in it. There's a joke at Southern. It depends on who you take for hermeneutics. You don't take hermeneutics, you take biblical theology from all these different professors in there. They'll have their own different nuances on how to do it. And so it's just kind of like, you take hermeneutics, you take biblical theology, and that's kind of, similar. And they're not the same in essence and in that, but that's just kind of, that's what you really get in it. And so we have our text, we're dealing with it. We have biblical theology, so it's trying to figure out, what does the Bible emphasize of its own accord, what it wants kind of the readers to know. Like, if you're a perfect reader, you would get this from the Bible. We all know we're not perfect readers, but that's, the intention of it. Now, the next step up is systematic theology, and it's based off of both. And so just to kind of define systematics, B.B. Warfield kind of explains it as the queen of the sciences. We can always we can talk about that in just a little bit. But the idea of systematic is to put a ordering to order how to order. Trying to think my definition here. To order different ideas about God, Christ, man in a systematic way, in a way that can be understood as taking the different pieces of the Bible. So you don't have this, in biblical theology, there's not this talk about God's omniscience or God's omnipresence. We get this idea because we read through these stories, we understand these stories, and this is what we see of God. So it's trying to take these bits and pieces scattered throughout the Bible, the Trinity fits under this, God, the hypostatic union, our ideas of what man is, the debate kind of on what does it mean to be an image of God kind of fits all in this idea of systematic theology as we try to describe in a systematic way what we believe. The best example of this, and we still use this today, and Ricky's doing a series on it, is confessions. So I in the teaser I mentioned, well, how do confessions? Well, confessions are systematic theology, telling of snippets of what particular churches or associations like the Second London believe about something. And so the church has always kind of had creeds, the Apostle Creeds and the Nicene Creed is the same thing. They're just little snippets of systematic theology of what we believe, taking from different parts in the Bible and fitting them together to have a kind of a holistic understanding of God as in the different ideas that don't necessarily grow and develop, but are there nevertheless in the Bible. And some people like Warfield will even say that this goes beyond Bible. It goes to all revelation. So both the general and special revelation, nature and the Bible. And that all of these kind of can fit together now to tell us who God is. And Warfield argues, and I'm convinced as I've been reading it, that there is one theology. There's not, like he compares it to geology. There's different ideas of geology, but there's one geology, and they're trying to figure out what is the true geology. Well, the same thing. There's one theology about who God is and what he is. And now you just have people competing on which one is the true theology. And that then systematic is strictly a science of observing and collecting without kind of understanding how we get to these points or the development to these points. Strictly is like, what do we believe? How do we believe it? How does this fit all together in one cohesive unit?
Yeah. Maybe we should give some resources on systematic theology. I know you showed that in your video. You showed that Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, and one of the pastors that's doing the 1689 said, "Throw that away."
So I did, but that's because I have Allison's historical theology, and they're set and they look nice together, the blue and the green. So I do have others. Like I do have John Frame, I have Strong's, and I have Michael Horton's. So I do have other systematic theology books.
Well, I have that too. I have Wayne Grudem's back there. Because honestly, I mean, think about this. When believers are getting into understanding theology and starting to kind of grow, they're looking for something to help them. And Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, while I know some people, especially Reformed guys, don't really, that's not their number one go-to source. And that's actually the source that the Truth Seekers Read was using to
badly.
Yeah. But that's something that people usually grab, and it has helped a lot of people to get at least an understanding of systematic theology. And so, but yeah, there's so many more. Burkhoff's, I shared that on the G220 ministry page. You can get it's free. You can find it online for free. And there's a lot of things actually you can find online for free these days, which is great. Or if you have a Kindle, I've seen it on Kindle. You can get it for like 99 cents. And Abney was on there for like 99 cents. And so you can find some good systematic theologies at decent prices, unless you want the actual copy in your hand, which I do prefer sometimes because I like to have it. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of resources.
Yeah. And I mean, even Calvin's Institutes is a systematic, if we, defining it in this way. And, he's organized maybe differently than how we organize now. We take it more from a Melanchthon was a little bit closer to how we do it. Calvin kind of follows that. There's different theories on what Calvin's actually trying to do exactly. But, so just these ideas of people gathering stuff and putting it together, in a cohesive unit. So I mentioned, and this has been more of a historical understanding, and maybe we can talk about what you think about this. I don't know if you've heard this before, but that theology is the queen of the sciences. It's kind of has always been this idea. So, and up until very recently, when colleges kind of started downplaying theological programs like Harvard and Yale and some of those, and kind of busting more into the not natural sciences, your physics, your geologies, chemistries, and stuff like that. The kind of hard sciences, maybe more as opposed to psychology, and which is considered a soft science, and then it's kind of there's not really objectiveness to it. So systematic has always kind of been seen as the queen of the sciences, in that it brings all of the hard sciences together with, so that be kind of natural revelation or reformer. Some people don't like natural theology because it's very Catholic sounding, but kind of the idea that the nature presents, that you have general revelation, what nature produces and tells us about who God is. And then you have the collection of now what we have in spiritual, in the special revelation and inspiration of the Bible. And some of that is, we get a lens to see natural theology or whatever better. But that systematic kind of brings them all together into one. And that we shouldn't be afraid to do scientific work to try to understand who God is, necessarily, and that bring this all together. And it kind of goes with and I know like R.C. Sproul has said it, and other people, and some people don't always like it, that all truth is God truth. That is 2 + 2 = 4 is equally God's truth, as, you'd say Romans 1 in that, because it displays an order that stuff can be knowable and objective, and maybe what some of those says. Ricky, have you ever heard these before? Or is this someone new?
I haven't in those in what you're talking there. The way that you said it, queen of the sciences and things like that. I've never heard it like that. I don't know if this, I think this falls under the same thing of what you're talking about, the same theme of what you're talking about. I have, when it comes to like a Genesis, like Answers in Genesis, with the Creation Museum and that, how they would research things from a biblical perspective, and they'd have these scientists that are researching things from a non-biblical perspective, and they always come up short because they're always trying to find things outside of God, where the biblical scientists are trying to find things that because they're operating in God's world that coincide with the Word of God, and not that the Bible is just a science book, but you know what I mean? And so I think in that sense, I've heard that type of conversation, but not from being the queen of sciences and things like that. I never heard that before.
So kind of your impression, or are you thinking like, that seems kind of weird, you can kind of go along with it?
Well, yeah, I could. I mean, when you think about that, I mean, obviously all truth is God's truth. As you were saying that, I kind of want to touch on that a little bit, because while all truth is God's truth, it doesn't mean that the unbeliever is using it to glorify God. Yeah, no doubt. And I think we've seen that because, I go back to certain experiences where, I was speaking out against certain groups, music groups, and they'd say, well, they're speaking some truth in their song to that we can use to God, because truth is truth. It's all truth is God's truth. Yeah, but they're singing to a false God, even though they're singing truths about God. They're singing to a false God, and therefore that would blaspheme the Lord. But yeah, I could see that. I mean, I could see how people would see that, and I think when you look at those schools that you mentioned, those that were the top schools, and they may be like high up there in schools now, but they've definitely declined a lot over the years once they started turning from their biblical roots.
Yeah, I mean, you just lay in, how I say, we just kind of destroy a foundation, and you think about it, and and kind of thinking about, obviously this is coming from kind of what I've understanding right now with Warfield, is that, but it's even, you take atheistic scientists who are not necessarily going with evolutionary science, which is more of a historical science. So you kind of if we push that to the side, but just, trying to understand specifically, how does the brain actually work? And they're sitting there and they might be atheistic, and, they're trying to find the physical aspect of it. And we can sit there and we can be amazed as how God has created this, the mind and all of its intricacies, and how it fires and able to rewrite and all these other things. And I think it brings a vastness when we think about some of these ideas, as people study about the human body and diet and sleep and these things, and we can read it. We have to understand they're not always Christian backgrounds, and so we filter it through the Bible. But at the same time, we can thank God that He's given these people the passion to study these things, and that we can learn, because we're bodies that need sleep, and sleep is good, and God has given us sleep for our own restoration. But also, it's part of faith that I can go to bed at night, even if I don't have things done. And I've been reading some of this, that I can still have faith that when I go to bed, I'll have the energy tomorrow to do it. And so, just trying to, think through all of these other areas in which God reveals how the body works, and how that can help us to even glorify Him better by not, over exhorting ourselves and becoming then dispassionate, or and changing our focus on just my own energy, but resting in Christ.
Yeah.
And so then how we've kind of, as we've transitioned, kind of seen how some of these fit together, together. And I think this is just kind of what I thought most of, especially when we were getting ready for last week's show. Just that, and even truth seekers, as we're debating, that all of these are needed, and they relate to each other. Oh, wait, I forgot one. We forgot historical theology. So historical theology, is a simple definition, is it's just the development of doctrine over time. It's understanding the line of godly men and heretics, and how they came to the positions, how they thought through these different ideas, and how doctrine kind of grew, became more defined. Language became more precise. This was mentioned really late in last week's show, when Josh, our guest, I don't think Josh was his name. What?
It was Josh second.
It was. Okay, that Josh kind of was like, he challenged, he said, well, so you're saying like these guys like are lying, or they're not speaking truth? And in reality, what, looking at them, they're speaking truth. It's just not accurate. And so when you go back in history, you have to realize doctrines develop, accuracy becomes more, and as you go back, accuracy is not as much. And so they can say things, and they can just sound like, at one point sound like they're Pelagian, and the next time they have like this idea, this more reformed idea, and you're like, what is going on here? Like, how am I supposed to think through this? And we just have to understand that, these are men trying to figure out. They're doing the same thing we're doing, but they're doing it with less history, and they're trying to figure all these things out. And so historical theology helps us to understand how the church has developed its doctrines, how creeds come about, why they say certain things, and why you see, like in the Baptist faith, the Message, they have a statement concerning about Christian education, and that's not in the Second London Baptist Confession. because the SBC deals with colleges and seminaries, and they need a theology of how to teach this stuff. Where the Second London Baptist doesn't have those type, and it's not something they're thinking about. And so, simply put, while you have this line between exegesis, biblical theology, and systematic theology, historical theology kind of sits on the side, kind of just helping us to understand how the church has got to where they are today.
Yeah, I like how you explain that there. It's helping us to understand that, because as we was having that conversation with Josh last week, and in many other conversations that we've had with people, especially, again, drawing from my experience of growing up in an independent fundamentalist Baptist church, that tradition and church history was never something really brought up or even encouraged to go and look or consider church history. But when you do look at those and you look at the councils, you look at these doctrines as they are developed over time, not that these are new to the Bible, it's just these people working this out, trying to understand it. Just like if we're brand new Christian and we're trying to understand the doctrine of the Trinity, we're trying to work it out in our and rationalize in our mind, how does this fit? How is there one God but three distinct persons? I don't grasp that. And so you're trying to work those things out, and we got to recognize that these men were trying to work these things out as well. And they would sit down with others to iron out these doctrines, this theology, so that this way, when there was heresies, they stood up against it and said, no, this is what the Bible's teaching. This is what it says. And they would hold fast to that. I was just reading, I was smiling when you was talking about it, because I've been reading this here, MacArthur's Manifesto, A Friendly Response, by Sam Waldron. And he mentioned that, it's not in MacArthur's church history is not on his side.
No, it's not, as a dispensationalist. And so, so as you think through these things, so now we kind of laid it out. You have kind of this line from text to, systematic theology. And then you have this kind of this other side. And what kind of, and I'm going to just, because of how B.B. Warfield describes this. I think B.B. Warfield, and we'll kind of, see this, describes how all of these things kind of work together, at least the first three, and then I'll add in how historical theology plays a part. Warfield uses, and Ricky, you'll probably appreciate this, a army type theme on how these things work, not an Air Force, an army.
Right.
And so he says that the immediate work of exegesis may be compared to the work of a recruiting officer. He draws out from the mass of mankind the men who are that constitute the army. So biblical theology organizes these men into companies and regiments and corps, arranging them in marching order, accounting them for service, and then systematic theology combines these companies and regiments and corps into an army, a single unitary whole determined by its own all-persuasive principle. And so you kind of see, and how he's looking at it, you have exegesis. You're trying to just gather whatever you can about the text and do it. And then biblical theology fits these kind of, as we're pulling these together, fits in together in themes and in ways like that. And then systematic brings them all into an army of one, to be deployed with it. Now, this is, B.B. Warfield's understanding that there is only one systematic theology, and you just have competing views on what that is. So, but you have then all these ones, and they go and they kind of, defend themselves and to be a whole. I think it shows a really good how those all work together. That systematic theology is kind of built upon having a good biblical theology with it. And I think that's where you have, like with Truth Seekers Reads and some of the anti-Calvinists, they kind of just don't have a biblical theology to work with. They just kind of go from text to systematic. And this is kind of how it is. And they miss this crucial point in the middle. Because if you do a study on atonement, it's particular. The atonement giving the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was for a particular people.
Yes, sir.
It's in the Old Testament. And so it would make sense that when Christ died, he died for a particular people. If he is the representation of Yom Kippur, if that is a theme in which he carries, which I think Hebrews talks about, I think in that. So then he is an atonement for a particular people. Now that particular people have grown in size, and it now includes different people of different races and different ethnicities and all these other things, but it's still for a particular people. And we can kind of use these, so they have like kind of their fall is that they don't have a good biblical theology to kind of build and to help systematize their, their view.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We got a question in the chat room. I'm asking some clarification, and then we'll attempt to maybe answer what he's attempting to ask. So, but yeah, I mean, I an army of one, absolutely. Warfield of one. No, I think as you're saying that, I mean, I would agree. There really is only one theology. There really is only one. It's man is fallible, and so I think B.B. Warfield's on point there. And I think the problem is, again, man. So we have these different ideas of theology, these different doctrines that we would argue over, like soteriology and things like that. But there really is just truth in the Word of God. And so man is then trying to work those things out and come to an understanding of what it really means.
Yeah. And so then when we then, apply historical theology kind of allows us to make sure we maintain within what the people have said before us. It's kind of the guardrails to make sure that we're not moving past points in which are put us outside of orthodoxy into heresy, which is I define heresy as damnable. So if you're a heretic, you are damnable. If you hold to that teaching, you might be ignorant and hold to a heretical teaching, and that's we've talked about that before. I know some people say heresy is not damnable, so I just wanted to clarify how I view it. But so it helps us, but and with it helps us just to think through. The Calvinism Arminian issue has been going on for 1600 years. So, I'm not a big, I'm kind of skeptical that it's going to be solved in my generation on how this works. This is going to be a debate that rages on. But what helps us is trying to understand where these debates and how it's moved. Arminianism today is not the Arminianism of Jacob Arminius, and it's changed with it. And so, historical theology then also helps us to try to understand some of the arguments and some of how it's developed. And then, we can use it then to help, in our systematics and in our apologetics to answer some of these critiques for it when they keep kind of popping up again and again.
Yeah. Yeah, some other things with theology. I don't know if you wanted to bring these ones up as well, or bring this up. Is there's also practical theology, and that's where we then take these things that we've learned and studied and apply those. How does this apply? And this is, I think, an area where you see people come up with so many different understandings because they apply things differently. So.
Yeah. No, I haven't studied practical theology as much, but yeah, just the idea that, it holds to the idea that, theology should be practical. That is, a theology should change either how I act or how I think. And so studying biblical theology, studying systematic theology on this basis should change how I think about God, how I know who God is, which changes ultimately how I worship God, because I only worship a God that I have knowledge of. So you can say you worship God, but if you're not worshiping God as he's revealed himself, you're not worshiping the true God. You're worshiping a god of your own imagination, or a demon if it's, is so connected to like a pagan religion of some sort. And I think this is important that, theology helps. And my pastor said multiple times, you kind of have to have like a theology of suffering before you start suffering. So you can kind of deal with the suffering. And you need to have certain theology in place to help you kind of cope through and to come out of suffering without losing your faith. I mean, there's arguments. Well, I believed God, but, then all these people died. I had all these hardships, and I'm just like, you know what? Because all this is happening to me, God must not be real. And we can answer that in these ways, and that knowing that God only gives good gifts. So suffering doesn't come as a direct from God, but then, we read our Bibles, we study how suffering comes throughout, that God's people always suffer from the beginning. Cain and Abel. Abel suffers by the Cain because Cain was jealous of his sacrifice. And so God's people's always suffering. So we should expect that. But we also know we have something greater and grander to look forward to. We know that he is with us through the suffering. I mean, Psalm 23, though through I walk through the valley of death, you're with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. This idea that God is still with us in our suffering, with us for it. So theology always has practicality, whether it changes our idea of who God is to reform it to the proper view of God, or it changes how we act and how we then work out in wisdom in our daily lives to glorify God. Yeah. We got a clarification?
Yeah. Prodigal Son by Grace, he was asking at first, what about Matthew 13:24 through 30, where it's talking about the parable of the weeds? And he says, and the idea, should we be weeding people out? And then for clarification, because as we was talking about, all truth is God's truth, and then how unbelievers, they may have some truth and be speaking truth, however, it may not be to glorify God. And so his clarification was, that's what when we were talking about that, he said, even preachers speaking some truth, but also things that are wrong, should we just count them as outcast, or should we use what they said to show truth when people talk? And so it's something that he's been struggling with. So to understand. And so, as it, again, going to that parable there where it's talking about where the weeds and the tares are growing up besides each other, or the weeds and the tares, the weeds, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The tares growing up. And then not to pull those out, because you may pull out some of the good ones. They're going to grow up. It's going to be, God's going to come and bring the harvest, right? But in that aspect of, what about those who are speaking half-truths with, or some truth with error? What should we do, Mike? You got any input there you give or advice?
So if I'm listening to someone who is, kind of on that, I mean, I just look for what is truth, and I hold on to what is truthful. Now, would I recommend something that I think is like half-truths or no? I mean, I'm never going to willingly try to listen or promote someone who I think can cause people to err in their theology. So I think, and
so you're not promoting Andy Stanley then, huh?
No.
Wait,
okay, so yeah, so joke. My pastor had to read an Andy Stanley book, and he completely hated it. So now we call Andy Stanley his favorite pastor, and so which he doesn't always appreciate as much, especially in recent comments. But so yeah, I mean, even if Andy Stanley says some good things, I might listen to him on leadership issues, possibly not. I mean, but at the same time, I can listen to other people talk about these things that I know are more theologically sound, more in line to what I currently believe. Not that I can't learn from those types of people, and with it. But then it's just, idea of just discernment and filtering. So if I'm listening, which at Liberty, they don't always have the most theologically sound speakers come in, and they have speakers from all walks of life and all kind of disciplines. So sometimes you just have to be there and think through some of these. Okay, what do they say? Well, do I really kind of hold to that? And just kind of think through these issues. So that's just kind of discernment. Kind of the wheat and tares passage, I think that's dealing more with salvific issues, being of salvation, that we should, kind of, it's just a parable talking about salvation, and that, we're going to have people in the church and we might not know if they're wheat or tares, but God will separate them in the end, for that. So that's kind of how I do. I've had to listen to enough bad preaching, through different means. And so, if I listen to it, I try to find truth to hold on to and to encourage myself with, unless I absolutely just want someone to listen to it and kind of just like spit out the bones type thing. I'm just going to try to give them the best thing I can give them on a topic if I'm supposed to recommend. So even like when I talk about Origen, I always caveat that I'm not a big fan of Origen, and that Origen has some serious problems to do, but he has some really good things to say every once in a while. And he is important in the church, for many different aspects.
Yeah. He's saying, he's not saying about promoting them, but saying, what about unbelievers or new believers who have found these people and are searching? To that, I would say, yeah, tell them, don't listen to those people. Go give them some solid resources, because, just like you, Mike, you've had to listen. You have had to listen to many sources and read many different sources, basically because of your school, and they want you to read certain things and even things that you wouldn't agree with, so that you can, practice your discernment and try to figure these things and wrestle through some of these things. Where with G220 Radio in the past, I've done that with, I would listen to sermons from people that I would not listen to on a regular basis, nor would I recommend them to anybody. And if someone was listening to them, I'd say, flee from that heretic. Don't listen to that. But I've listened to it for the sake of trying to understand their argument or what they're teaching, so that I can then do a show on it or whatnot. So I've listened to many sermons from people, if we're going to do a sermon review or something, and I'm just like, man, this is horrible. I would not recommend that to anybody. And if there's a new believer, I would tell them to get out of that church, go find something better. Here's some resources, or here's some churches that you can, go to that would be way better biblically than that one that you're in.
Yeah, and just, even with like books and resources, I mean, it'd be the same thing. If you're carrying a William P. Young, The Shack, I might burn it on the spot. I mean, that's censorship, and I'm not, a big fan of censorship, as we've seen in the last couple of days. But, there's like, hey, don't you, people have realized this has different misrepresentations, like of the Trinity, and maybe you should read something a little bit more, solid. I know it's fiction, and you could, what do you do with C.S. Lewis and, that type of thing. But yeah, I think you just have to, if you see it, and I think it's a gentle thing. And don't be like aggressive. Don't burn their books in their hands. Is what I'm saying. That's not a good response. Just gently, or even recommend, if you have a resource to give them a resource that will be, that talks about the same topic, but from a better viewpoint. So,
well, we got about 5 minutes or so left in the program today, man. What do you want to say to wrap this up?
So, it probably has come out, I think this is important for a Christian's life, as a Christian life, to understand that theology takes different forms. They have different levels, and in argumentation and in our own life, I think we should focus more on, understanding how to exegete, and, Bible reading and kind of exegesis in that way. Studying the different themes, going through a biblical theology, or even you have books like on, I guess a book on suffering would be less, but kind of, there's some good series um about like a theology of work, something to help to kind of put these ideas together, to see how they kind of go through, and that we should be at least focusing on for both our own personal study and um, you know, understanding that this will come in helping when we're discussing the gospel with people, just to kind of think through these ideas and to meditate and to understand them, and you know read a systematic that you can understand, and you're going to get something. You don't have to, you might, if you're having problems with like Grudem and he's talking about how we can prophesy today, but it's not inerrant prophecy, and and you're like, I mean, he sounds kind of persuasive. I don't understand all of this. Go to your pastor and maybe they can recommend something that you can help counter or to do it. And just understand that we need all of these kind of just to become better Christians and to know who God is and to live in wisdom. Wisdom comes from knowing God and to knowing his precepts and meditating on who he is and on his law, and that our Christian life depends on these types of things. And then, but also don't neglect historical theology. Don't make it primary. I think there's, a problem there just studying all the history, but understanding how some of these people, read Athanasius, and as he's, wrestling with this idea of the Trinity and trying to combat the heretics and the Arians and seeing their arguments, because we have Arians in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and just to kind of study just how to do it, supplementary focus on biblical theology, systematic theology, trying to be better. But, every once in a while, just sprinkle some of the historical theology and kind of help you to think better, to understand truth better, and even get nice analogies to understand like the Trinity better, if there is ever a good Trinity analogy.
Yeah. Amen, brother. Amen. I want to encourage you guys, the listeners, if you want to find out more about us here at G220 Radio, you can go to G220ministries.com. Go there. You can look and read all about us there. Our testimonies are there, as well as you can find out some of the things going on with the radio show. I'll be honest with you, I don't update it as often as I should, but you can still find out what's going on there and listen to past episodes and everything. As well as find out if there's any events going on. G220 Ministries, something that I've kind of gotten away from, but I want to make sure that we come back to is G220 Ministries and radio is very evangelistic. And so we have some evangelism outreaches going on. And if you are in the area and interested in joining us, we have some things going on. August 18th, we've got the Flood the Sidewalk, where we're going to be standing against abortion at preterm in Cleveland area, as well as we have the Apple Festival coming up in September, and our college evangelism tour coming up in October. It's going to be 3 days going to 4 different college campuses. And so if you want to join us or register for some of those events, you can go and do that at G220ministries.com. Until next time, that's all I have. Mike, any last words?
If you want more information about these, or want some good recommendations for some of the stuff we talked about to learn more about this, hit us up on the Facebook page, send us a private message if you want, and we'll try to get back to you with some good recommendations. And if I don't have one, or if Ricky or George don't have one, we probably have people who might have ones that we can recommend, and from people we trust. So, to help you out with all these, because it all matters. Theology matters.
Absolutely. Until next time, that's been G220 Radio.